Hello, and welcome to this special episode of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Perrin, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore of Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many others. Melikaliki Laka Maka, Bill.
Mele Kalikimaka to you too, Seth. For those of you who are from England, that means Merry Christmas in Hawaiian. And I am wearing an inappropriately festive shirt.
Wow, I didn't see the bottom of it until now.
Yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah.
awesome.
Given the semi-sweet, poignant, kind of bittersweet topic we're going to talk about today, Seth, but I have a whole closet full of aloha shirts, as we call them in Hawaii. We don't call them Hawaiian shirts in Hawaii. We call them aloha shirts. And I don't get to use them very often. So I figured today was the day.
Yeah, it's very John Marshall-esque, I'm sure is what a lot of people are going to say.
Aha. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Soon
Hmm.
as you popped into the Zoom, I went, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, today's
So,
Bill, when you and I discussed doing this a couple weeks back, you said, "Hey, we ought to do something on Christmas." And we've never done anything like this. The only thing, the closest thing we've ever come to is Memorial Day when I read
right.
the Dear Jackie letter. And that's
Hmm.
it. And we've never done anything like this before, but I feel it's appropriate because the fact that this episode, usually we record things a month ahead of time. Today it's the 10th of December, so this will air exactly 2 weeks from now on Christmas Eve. So we figure that that's more than appropriate.
Hmm. Yeah,
And
for me too, Seth, because I've spent two Christmases on deployment, never in a combat zone underwater. But, for us, you can't communicate, you can't do anything. Um, And so, what the wives would do, submarines were all male then, is pack things up and bundle them and box them and then give them to us before we deploy. And then on Christmas Eve-ish, maybe a couple days before, we would open the box and see what was in there. There'd be presents, there'd be decorations. We'd decorate the wardroom and the cruise lounge for Christmas. So this is very meaningful to me. And when you kind of roll the time travel machine back to 1941, 42, 42, 43, 44, 45. Every Christmas had a different flavor back then, didn't it, Seth?
it did indeed. And we're going to get into most of those as we go through today's episode. And it's this is different than what we normally do, but hopefully no less poignant and impactful because I'm not gonna lie to you, like we were talking about before we recorded, Bill, there were a couple times I was writing this and reading it over again to make sure I didn't put anything stupid in there that I kind of got a little choked up. So
So
anyway,
did I, Seth. So did I. And I got to tell you, thinking of them and then remembering my own situation, it got really lonely. You can't talk to anyone on a submarine. There was no email, nothing, right? And so I relate somewhat, but nobody was shooting at me. So to that extent, I can only imagine what these guys were going through.
well, with that, let's get into it. So here we go. I'll be home for Christmas. You can count on me. Please have snow and mistletoe and presents on the tree. Christmas Eve will find me where the love light gleams. I'll be home for Christmas, if only in my dreams. The lyrics written by James Gannon with the accompanying music by Walter Kent first hit American airwaves in November 1943, around the same time that Operation Galvanic, the invasion of Basio or Taro, whatever you want to call it, was playing out in the first operation of the Great Central Pacific Drive. Made famous by the incomparable Bing Crosby, the song, with its wistful, dreamy lyrics, was written from the point of view of an American serviceman far from home in this, the third wartime Christmas for the United States. The lyrics express the feeling that every American overseas felt at that time. I just want to go home. When you think about those lyrics from the song that probably produces joyful memories to those watching or listening to me right now, and juxtapose them with the carnage and the horror that was playing out on Red Beach 1 on Bayshore at that very moment, It's bone chilling. As Americans at home listen to Bing croon his way through the song and end it with, "I'll be home for Christmas if only in my dreams," those words and the mental images it produces become absolutely heartbreaking. So many Marines lying on those beaches at Bayshio would most certainly not be home for Christmas ever again.
I'll be home for Christmas, if only in my dreams.
For many of us, the holiday season and especially Christmas have hopefully happy memories of time spent with family and friends, presents we got as kids, visits to Santa Claus, and many other images in our minds. However, during the war, Bill, many of those images were surely just pipe dreams.
They were indeed, Seth. And in preparing for today's episode, I went through 200 different versions of that song. And for me, this song, I'll Be Home for Christmas, has to be really austere, has to be played down. It's actually a waltz, played in three-fourths time, and people kind of miss that. But what I'm looking for, going through those 200 versions of it, two of them out of 200 were kind of conveyed the tone that I think of when I think of I'll Be Home for Christmas as a sad, homesick, heartbroken song. And the more recent version of that was the one done by Josh Groban. Too many of them are glitchy. And I'm not a Josh Groban fan, but his really conveyed the heart and the spirit and the meaning of what that song meant. But then, Seth, I have to tell you, Bing Crosby's original version was right up there, even though people today would call it kind of schmaltzy, as a lot of 1940s music seems to be considered for modern ears. I can hear it through those guys' ears, Seth, and it was heartbreaking.
It really is. It really is. If you listen to it and you really, really listen to it, eh, and you feel it. You really do feel it. And it makes it all the more heartbreaking when you think about the scenes that were going down at that time. It really does. But Bayshio Taro was not the first wartime holiday season at all. So Pearl Harbor had been attacked less than 3 weeks before that very first wartime Christmas for the United States. 18 days before December 25th, 1941, the Empire of Japan attacked the American military bastion on Oahu, the Philippines, Wake, Guam, and Midway, catapulting the United States into the war that would come to define not only this country, but the world as we know it today. The threat of invasion in Hawaii was very real, despite the Japanese having no real intentions of landing troops on the island. Civilians living on Oahu feared daily for their very lives, as many people, despite the large American military presence all over the island, felt that the Japanese could literally walk ashore anytime they wanted to. American correspondents who had been rapidly sent to Hawaii after the attack studied the faces of the citizenry. Many of the correspondents that had been sent to Hawaii had also been in France in 1940, and the panic that they saw in the faces of the people in Oahu was exactly what they saw in France in 1940. For the people of Oahu, Bill, there was no Christmas merriment that very first year of the American War, was there?
There certainly wasn't, Seth. Invasion jitters gripped both American coasts on the mainland. AAA guns, anti-aircraft guns, sprouted along the coasts, and the reports of Japanese enemy planes inbound, Germans on the New York side, Japanese on the Pacific side, abounded. But none of them were true. The early part of December was rife with false reports of enemy aircraft over Boston, LA, New York, San Francisco, and even Chicago. It was the boy crying wolf over and over and over again, to the point where people got desensitized and started thinking that maybe no attack would ever happen. Not quite true. In San Francisco, though, the 4th Army Interceptor Command reported that 30-odd enemy planes ranged last night from San Jose at the south tip of the bay to the huge naval yard at Mare Island. It triggered the first blackout of San Francisco in history. The command said that U.S. Army Air Force's pursuit planes followed the first of these enemy squadrons but were unable to locate them. This sounds like a UFO scare, Seth. It was crazy. Navy units then launched a fruitless search for aircraft and Japanese aircraft carrier, which would have been possible, but wasn't there, 500 miles off the coast. Lieutenant John L. DeWitt, leader of the 4th Army and Western Defense Command, said, "I don't think there's any doubt that the planes came from a carrier. Why bombs were not dropped, I do not know. It might have been better if some bombs had been dropped to awaken the city. Why bombs were not dropped? Because the planes weren't there," Seth. He warned, "This is war. Death and destruction may come from the skies at any moment." But really, I don't blame folks for being jumpy, Seth.
No, I mean, this was an unprecedented time, in American history. And I mean, for all we didn't know clearly what the Japanese were capable of militarily. We had no idea, obviously, and it's the reason that Pearl Harbor was attacked in the first dang place. So for all we knew, Akagi and Kaga were roaming off of California's shores somewhere, waiting to, target Mare Island or whatever the case may be. So we did not know what the heck was going on, and those fears were very legitimate in the eyes of the American people. Obviously, now we know completely false, but still, in the hours following Pearl Harbor, fears of a possible Japanese invasion of the West Coast were real, with widespread confusion and panic. There were only 100,000-ish troops to guard the entire Pacific shore. Think about that. From Washington State all the way down to, Chula Vista.
San Diego.
Right. There's 100,000 American soldiers. I mean, that's not a lot of people for that expanse of territory. A frantic official called the White House and suggested that because the Pacific coast was so vulnerable, new defense lines would have to be drawn up in the Rocky Mountains. I mean, this is like, panic waving like a wave over the shores of the United States. Across the nation, Christmas was a far-off vision until the citizenry were spoken to by their president. Now, everybody has their own opinions of FDR. Some say that he was, man, whatever. We're not going to get into that. We're not going to talk about politics on this. But what he was, especially in the eyes of the American populace, especially in 1941, if nothing else, he was a leader. He had been the president of the United States since 1933, and most children who were alive to remember this time, he was the only president they knew. So this guy was like a father to the populace of this country, and they hung on every word the man said. On December 9th, 1941, FDR delivered one of his most important, if not untruthful, fireside chats. In it, he addressed the false information that had spread across the country like a tidal wave. He said, and I quote, "So far, the news has been all bad. We have suffered a serious setback in Hawaii." Yeah, no kidding. "Our forces in the Philippines, which include the brave people of that Commonwealth, are taking punishment but are defending themselves vigorously. The reports from Guam and Wake and Midway Islands are still confused, but we must be prepared for the announcement that all of these 3 outposts have been seized. The casualty list of these first few days will undoubtedly be large. I deeply feel the anxiety of all the families of the men in our armed forces and the relatives of peoples in the cities which have been bombed. I can only give them my solemn promise that they will get news just as quickly as possible." FDR continues. He says, quote, "This government will put its trust in the stamina of the American people and will give the facts to the public just as soon as 2 conditions have been fulfilled. First, that the information has been definitely and officially confirmed, and second, that the release of the information at the time it is received will not prove valuable to the enemy, directly or indirectly," which is 100% true. "Most earnestly, I urge my countrymen to reject all rumors. These ugly little hints of complete disaster fly thick and fast in wartime. They have to be examined and appraised. Many rumors and reports which we now hear originate, of course, with enemy sources. Completely untrue. For instance, today the Japanese are claiming that as a result of their one action against Hawaii, they have gained naval supremacy in the Pacific. Completely true. They have gained naval supremacy. This is an old
Yep.
trick of propaganda. Yeah, boy, you're not kidding. This is an old trick of propaganda, which has been used innumerable times by the Nazis. The purposes of such fantastic claims are, of course, to spread fear and confusion among us and goad us into revealing military information which our enemies are desperately anxious to obtain. Our government will not be caught in this obvious trap, and neither will the people of the United States, Bill.
Yeah, that's what we would call today an information operations campaign. It was absolutely true that the Japanese had naval supremacy in the Pacific at this point of the war. He's denying it because he needs to deny it. The president's words seemed to calm the people almost overnight. Within days, most air raid warnings evaporated, though not completely. And people, for the most part, operated the remainder of December 1941 like any other Christmas season. Of course, Jimmy Stewart was still an air raid warden in It's a Wonderful Life, which you should watch tonight, folks, if you haven't seen it this season yet. Shops burst with toys, goods, and trinkets of the season. Silk stockings at $1.25 a pair, a bargain at twice the price. Stockings in the current wonder weave called nylon, this newfangled chemical invention called nylon, they sold for $1.65. Nylon stockings would be almost non-existent by the following Christmas, when the fabric would be the stuff of parachutes. Among the Christmas toy glut, shops across America advertised a remote-controlled bomber at $1.98 that ran along a suspended wire to attack a battleship, ironically enough, which is exactly how we would end up fighting this war. Christmas trees were in plentiful supply, and the Rockettes in New York danced at Radio City. This doesn't sound like a nation in the brink of war, does it, Seth?
It doesn't, and that's why I wanted to include this. Is that and you're going to see this throughout this episode. The difference in the battlefront and the home front could not be more profound. And in December, and we're going to get to some of the actions in the Pacific in December 41 just very briefly. Again, contrast that what we're going to talk about here in just a minute, like on Wake Island, with what you just talked about. It's literally two different worlds, completely different worlds. And to a point, I understand. That's why FDR gave that fireside chat, was to calm everybody. He's basically saying, just calm it. Okay, yeah, the situation sucks and it's crazy and we don't know everything that's going on, but just cool your jets. And that's what it did. It's what it did to a degree. In Washington, D.C., on Christmas Eve, Americans tried to put aside their fears and celebrate in their traditional ways. Thousands of shivering people were admitted to the White House grounds to watch Roosevelt light the national tree and listen as Churchill, who was there on a visit, tried to lift their spirits. Old Winnie said, and I quote, "Let the children have their night of fun and laughter. Let the gifts of Father Christmas delight their play. Let us grown-ups share to the full in their unstinted pleasures before we turn again to the stern task and the formidable years that lie before us. Resolve that by our sacrifice and daring, these same children shall not be robbed of their inheritance or denied their right to live in a free and decent world." Winston Churchill is a polarizing figure. If nothing else, the man was a hell of an orator, Bill.
He sure was, and writer.
Mhm.
And it's not polarizing to me. I thought he was exactly the right leader of the United Kingdom at that time.
Sure.
It's so
Sure.
sad that he fell so quickly after the war was over. But I'm going to spin off that point you just made, Seth, because if you want a really bold contrast between what was happening in the United States with citizens in this country and what was happening, for example, in the United Kingdom at the same time, watch the old Peter O'Toole movie, Goodbye, Mr. Chips. And you're going to see a scene where he's a school master. I think he's a schoolmaster at the time, might still be a teacher. And this buzz bomb comes down and drops down on a theater-ish kind of thing where his wife is doing a musical and kills her. And some of the best acting you can ever see is when after Peter O'Toole's been notified that his wife is now dead from this German buzz bomb, he just walks out, and the look in his eyes, he doesn't need to say anything. The look in his eyes conveys the most profound grief I've ever seen in an actor in history. And that was happening all the time in a whole bunch of countries around the world. In the United States, we were watching the Rockettes. In the Pacific, however, life was anything but normal. The Japanese advanced on all fronts, and for the Marines on Wake Island, the closer Christmas drew near, the farther their salvation pulled away. Just days before December 20th, to be exact, a Navy PBY piloted by Ensign Howard 80, of future Midway fame, landed at Wake Island and brought the news that a Navy relief force was on its way. And indeed it was. A carrier task force centered around Saratoga was inbound, at least for a while. 80 relayed that the task force was due on Christmas Eve. Marines and civilians alike had renewed confidence that they could hold out for a few more days, then everything would be all right. But that expected relief would never come. Admiral Pye, did an episode on this, who had temporarily taken command of the Pacific Fleet after husband Kimmel had been relieved for the Pearl Harbor attack. Admiral Pye was a master tactician, but he was also a realist, with intel telling him that elements of the Kidobutai, the Japanese fleet, were afoot, and they were. Pye pulled the plug on the rescue mission. Wake's defenders never knew it, for the Japanese landed on December 23rd, and in the confused fight that ensued, the garrison on Wake surrendered and endured Christmas 1941 in Japanese captivity. Across the ocean, Hong Kong surrendered on Christmas Day. While Christmas at home was normal, it was agony in the Pacific Theater of Operations. But the real holiday, Agony, had yet to begin, Seth.
Yeah. Ironically enough, I guess maybe not really. I'm reading a book on Wake Island right now, and it's one of the things that it kind of gets swept under the rug, because Wake is in between Pearl Harbor and everything that happens in between there and like Midway. It kind of unfortunately gets swept under, and there's a lot of myths about Wake, and we are going to do an episode on Wake Island in the future here, but you can understand the sheer agony that these guys were going through, thinking that something was coming their way to help them out. And of course, it never does. So the second wartime Christmas for the United States, 1942, was vastly different than the year before. With Guadalcanal fairly well secured by December 1942, the Marines and soldiers ashore celebrated the holiday as best they could. And we're talking about in the canal here, which is to say, barely at all. Much of the 1st Marine Division was on its way to Australia, and for them, the holiday season would be spent in the bosom, quite literally, of the Australians in Melbourne. Yeah, I did that on purpose.
Yeah, not very subtle there, Seth.
No. And the surrounding terrain. In New Guinea, however.
Yeah. I think they call them Sheilas, or at least they did back then.
Yeah. In New Guinea, however, it was a completely different story. The inhospitable jungle with 100-degree temperatures and humidity thick enough to choke on, sounds like New Orleans in August, did not lend itself to that holiday feeling. For the frontline GI, Christmas was the farthest thing from his mind. Quote, "Who ever heard of a Christmas where the temperature was 100 degrees and it was a question whether you would live until night," unquote, wrote war correspondent Merlin Spencer. He wasn't wrong either. The fighting had been brutal in some of the most, if not the most, inhospitable place on earth. GIs and Aussies had pushed the Japanese back at a high cost, and for them, the holiday was anything but pleasant, Bill.
Yeah. Again, getting back to the quote, he says, "Our strength is about gone. Most of us have dysentery. Boys are falling out and dropping back with fever. Continual downpour of rain. It's hard to cook rice and tea. Bully beef makes us sick. We climb straight up for hours, then back down again. God will it ever end. We did several episodes on this, actually. Celebrating Christmas in a place like New Guinea was far-fetched, but the men craved something, anything that would remind them of home. Men of the cloth took great risks to make their way to the front line on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. The chaplains administering communion or praying over the men who wanted the blessing. One chaplain from Melbourne, Clive Cox, was killed by Japanese fire just 2 days after Christmas. For some Aussies who had just finished dragging the wounded back to the field hospital, the best Christmas gift they received was candy that was waiting for them. For others in the same contingent, just bringing their wounded back was gift enough. Australian Reverend Hartley wrote after the war, "A soldier came to me on Christmas Day and said, 'You know, Padre, today when I knew that the men who had suffered here in silence so long had gotten safely through, I felt that was the best Christmas present I ever had.'" And Seth, there are thousands of people who just wanted to survive. That's the only Christmas present they wanted.
Yep. That quote right there that you just went through, Bill, touched me more than any of the other ones in this whole episode that we're going to do. Because, I mean, think about that.
Mm.
You know, you're worried about getting silk stockings for your wife back home in the States, and this Australian soldier's just his best Christmas present is making sure that his buddies are going to live through the day. That's
Mm.
it's about as conflicting views as you could possibly ever have. So, in Port Moresby, which was a world away from the hell of the front lines, Christmas 1942 was just another workday. Most of the turkeys had been sent to the frontline GIs and Aussies where they were most needed, frankly. For the rear echelon, at least in Moresby, rations would be their Christmas meal, K-Rats. In a funny interlude, some GIs attached to the 8th Photo Recon Squadron found a scrawny turkey and decided to eat him. Before they did that, they attempted to fatten him up. Such was the craving for fresh turkey during the holidays that the men put up a barbed wire fence and posted 2 armed guards to protect this damn bird from scroungers who most certainly would have
Would have been
kidnapped and
eaten.
eaten that turkey.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
That tickled the hell out of me, right?
Yep.
So, General George Kinney, who we've talked about a lot throughout this whole series, flew up 2 Red Cross female nurses and a 5-piece orchestra. The ladies dressed up a hut with colored paper while the small band played traditional hymns. The ladies then passed out cigarettes, candy, and little trinkets that they had wrapped up in paper on the airplane on the way up. For the GIs, it was the best thing that they had ever seen, Bill.
Yeah, I don't know if you can call a 5-piece an orchestra, but yeah, they were lucky to get that. And the
Yeah.
traditional hymns would have been, especially poignant. And for General Bob Eichelberger, who we've also talked about a lot, his Christmas was less festive than those behind the lines. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, quote, "There were no lights or tinsel in the palm trees, and a chubby-cheeked Santa would have found himself sweating in his furs." Those furs, by the way, segue here, Seth, that's an invention of the Coca-Cola company for a Christmas ad. Getting back to Eichelberger's letter, "We hung our socks out and got water in them. You'll never know how I missed you this Christmas season. Fortunately, we were busy night and day. And because of that, we managed to pass the holiday without feeling too low. The men are getting to know me now, and I get a lot of greetings. I can usually get them laughing. And then there is the American cemetery with his white line of crosses, and I choke up every time I pass it." Nobody laughing there, Seth.
Not at all. And, everybody knows my love for General Eichelberger, and this is one of those reasons why.
Yep.
So at home, and I'm talking about the United States, Christmas 1942 was vastly different than the year before. In 41, the war still felt rather distant, despite the attack on Pearl Harbor. But this year, 1942, it was close. Many families now had young men in the service. Even if these guys had not shipped out yet, they weren't at home. The signs of longing for home for new servicemen was evident in the flood of mail that was sent between October 42 and January 1943. Get this, over 50 million, 50 million letters and 2.5 million packages were sent to and from servicemen just between October and January of 1942 and January 43 in the United States. That is a tremendous amount of mail. And this technically is the first real wartime Christmas of for the United States.
Right.
Gift giving was different in the States. Many traditional toys were scarce or simply unavailable, with most metal being put out for the war effort at this time. Cardboard, paper, and wooden toys were the toys that were in stock generally. Most toy sets featured a military theme. Outdoor Christmas lights were one of the first wartime casualties for obvious reasons. In Antioch, California, for example, outdoor Christmas lights were turned off on December 11th, 1941, and the tradition of lighting the community Christmas tree was postponed for the duration. Blackout conditions on the West Coast and dim outs on the East Coast, and later a nationwide dim out to conserve fuel meant Christmas might be merry, but certainly not as bright, Bill.
Yeah, and Christmas trees were harder to obtain due to labor shortages just to cut down the trees and shipping priorities to get, wartime food and ammunition where they needed to go. But they were still available in many communities. So, guys that were still not in service could go out and cut their own trees and things like that. Beginning in 1942, real Christmas trees were in short supply because many of the men who typically chopped them down were either in the military or working in the armament industry. The Chicago Daily Tribune reported. At the same time, labor costs and fees paid to landowners for tree cutting rights both soared, driving up the retail price of live Christmas trees and contributing to the popularity of the much hated artificial versions. Though artificial Christmas trees had been both imported to and manufactured in the United States for decades at that point, this was when the faux furs really gained traction. Prior to the war, artificial Christmas trees made from goose feathers were the most popular variety, but after the U.S. stopped importing goods from Germany, including feather trees, they were no longer available or desirable. Instead, people opted for artificial trees made in America using Visha, which is a type of artificial straw, or those from the United Kingdom based Addis Housewares Company, which used their machinery for, get this, making toilet brushes, and they converted those machines that made toilet brushes to produce faux Christmas trees with similarly stiff bristles that also doubled as toilet brushes if you had a problem in your toilet, Seth. This is, go ahead.
I'm laughing because I swear to God, when I was a kid, my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, had
Mhm.
an artificial Christmas tree. It's the first artificial tree I ever saw in my life. Because my family always got, my dad's from Ohio, as you know, Bill. We
Mhm.
always get a blue spruce every single year, and that tradition continues into my own household. That being said, my grandparents had a fake tree, and I swear to God, it looked like a toilet brush. Like the bristles on it looked like a toilet brush. I swear.
Yeah. In the early 60s, I remember these things still around, right? And it didn't occur to me until we prepared for this episode what they were. But yep, they were still around, Seth.
Yeah. Yeah. And theirs was old. Like my grandparents' tree was
Mhm.
old, man. So I have no doubt it came from the 60s, and it probably was one of these toilet brush Christmas trees. So
Yeah.
food, while it was rationed for sure, was not an issue. Turkeys, hams, and all the trimmings were easily accessible to people across the United States, despite the common memory of thin wartime menus. Only sugary sweets that were harder to find, as both sugar and butter were heavily rationed. It was not difficult to get a turkey in 1942. It was not difficult to get a ham either in 1942, much to the against the popular memory. The president, FDR, sent his traditional Christmas message to the citizenry on Christmas Eve that year. In it, he said, and I quote, "This year I am speaking on Christmas Eve, not to this gathering at the White House only, but to all citizens of our nation, to the men and women serving in our American armed forces, and also to those who wear the uniforms of the other United Nations. I give you a message of cheer. I cannot say Merry Christmas, for I think constantly of those thousands of soldiers and sailors who are in actual combat throughout the world. But I can express to you my thought that this is a happier Christmas than last year in the sense that the forces of darkness stand against us with less confidence in the success of their evil ways. To you who toil in industry for the common cause of helping to win the war, I send a message of cheer that you can well continue to sacrifice without recrimination and with a look of Christmas cheer, a kindly spirit toward your fellow man. It is significant that tomorrow, Christmas Day, our plants and factories will be stilled. That is not true of the other holidays we have long been accustomed to celebrate. On all other holidays, work goes on gladly for the winning of the war, Bill."
Yeah. So moving on to 1943, Christmas in the Pacific was busy. We covered, the entire season of 1943 on this podcast. But as noted in the introduction of this episode, Operation Galvanic had taken place in November, as had Bougainville, the Rabaul raids, and December 26th, the 1st Marine Division's invasion of Cape Gloucester. Men of the old breed celebrated Christmas aboard ship, just one day before landing on Cape Gloucester. The men were treated to turkey and all the trimmings on board ship as they made their way to their second campaign of the war. Ashore on Bougainville, where the fighting had been vicious since November, the battles of Hellzapoppen Ridge and 600A wrapped up on Christmas Day. For the Marines of the 3rd Division, specifically Able and Charlie companies from 121 Marines, 1st Battalion, 21st Marines, there was no celebrating anything. 17 of their brothers were killed on Christmas, with a further 32 being wounded. For sailors in Uncle Sam's Navy in the Pacific Theater of Operation, Christmas was something to be celebrated when given the opportunity, which was rare. Usually, working parties occupied every minute of the day when not on combat operations. The working parties did not differentiate between holidays and regular days. By the way, it's the same at sea today. You can't tell a holiday from a regular day because you're working. On occasion, the crew did get lucky. Aboard USS Montpelier, CL-57, a diarist, James Fahey, recalled, quote, "We sneaked in on the Japanese this morning while they were sleeping. At 0030, we started our bombardment on the northern tip of Bougainville. The guns of our ships never stopped firing. The sound was deafening. Enormous explosions occurred when ammunition dumps were hit. It was quite a sight." Seth?
Yeah. So the action that Fahey is writing about, which I always encourage anybody who can pick up his book on Amazon, is called Pacific War Diary. I think that's what it's called. Yeah, that's what it's called. It's a fantastic read. The writing he's talking about is when Cruiser Division 12, Crew Div 12, stood out of Tulagi at 1830 on 22 December 1943 for a repeat of the bombardment that they had done against Japanese installations against Buka just a few days previous. The cruisers were hoping to lure the Japanese to respond to another feigned amphibious landing. 4 of Arleigh Burke's Deseron 23 Little Beavers assumed screening responsibilities en route on 23 December. Cloudy weather conditions with light squalls cleared to scattered clouds with unlimited visibility as night fell. Hoping to catch the enemy's attention, the ships entered the American ships encountered no enemy ships or planes on approach, though a radar beam was detected from the direction of Buka. At 0040 is what the Navy says, 0030 is what Fahey says, and it's probably somewhere in between. Montpelier's main battery began shelling Bonnan's airfield and dispersal and personnel areas, supply dumps, and fuel and ammunition storage around the airfield and southern shore of Buka. Her secondary battery targeted anti-aircraft guns, personnel and supply areas, fuel storage, barge and seaplane anchorages. Montpelier's Black Cat spotter, which we've talked about black cats here and there, Bill. Those are the PBYs that are painted black, that are fitted with tons of guns and radar. Were scouting for targets for Montpelier and the rest of the task force. Her 6-inch guns, Montpelier's 6-inch guns, that night alone fired a salvo every 10 seconds. 1,010 shells were expended by Montpelier alone that night. 5-inch guns every 6 seconds. 1,071 5-inch shells were fired. They absolutely saturated the target area and started 2 or 3 low-intensity fires. Enemy shore batteries flashed, but no shells fell near the American column. So as you yourself just said, Bill, Christmas 1943 for the United States Navy in the Pacific was just another day.
Yeah, it was. And contrary to the mission's intent, Admiral Tip Merrill's force had achieved complete surprise. Montpelier's guns ceased at 0055 and Task Force 39 retired at 0100 at 26 knots. Pretty slow for little beavers, right? 4 high-speed minesweepers took over as Crew Div 12's screening at 0800 as Halsey sent the little beavers north to intercept a possible Rabaul-Buka Tokyo Express run. We talked a lot about the Tokyo Express back when we covered the Solomons. Crew Div 12 and the minesweepers returned to Purvis Bay at Tulagi during the forenoon watch on Christmas Day. Hoffman reported later, quote, all officers and men conducted themselves in accordance with the best traditions of the naval service, unquote. That's the way you end every standard decoration write-up. Fahey wrote of the action, Premier Tojo will remember this Christmas, even though they probably didn't celebrate Christmas in Japan at that time. On Christmas Day, Montpelier and Fahey were headed for Purvis Bay. And instead of waking up to a turkey dinner, Fahey and many of his shipmates aided in the refueling of the cruiser from a tanker. Following refueling, the ship arrived in Purvis Bay, and the crew set about replenishing the magazines after the previous night's bombardment in the pouring rain. Only later that evening did the crew get their Christmas dinner, which was, of course, turkey. After chow, they finished loading ammo. So, Seth, there's a lot going on, and it's just really the beginning of a campaign, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's the Solomons, and you're 100% right. Obviously, you and I covered this extensively, and it's some of the episodes, for whatever reason, they don't have a whole ton of views. I think it's because people really don't know what the hell happened down there in 1943. Everybody thinks it ended at Guadalcanal and it picked back up again at Tarawa. No, you couldn't be farther from the truth. There's a lot of things that go on in the Solomons in 43. Go back and listen to those episodes from season 2. There's a lot of things that are really revealing in there. So later that Christmas evening, Christmas carols were sung on deck of the Montpelier, and even Admiral Aaron Tip Merrill strode up to the mic and sang with the crew. Following carols, the crew gathered topside again to watch a movie, and as Fahey put it, quote, everyone had a great time, and they would remember this Christmas for a long time. I wonder where I'll be next Christmas, he wrote. And Christmas 1944, Bill, was dominated by the European theater of operations and, of course, the Battle of the Bulge. On Christmas Eve, the Belgian troop ship Leopoldville was sunk with the cost of over 760 American lives, as well as 56 of the ship's crew. The Bulge was raging, and Christmas Eve proved to be the high water mark of the Germans' offensive on the Western Front that year. In the Pacific, the combat centered in the Philippines. Sixth Army had captured Palampan on Leyte on Christmas Day, with Leyte being declared secure the following day, Bill.
Yeah, the Navy was, for the most part, at rest that Christmas season. Halsey's third fleet had finished its tussle with the first typhoon, covered that, and had just returned to Ulithi for repairs. In his diary, Halsey wrote, quote, with characteristic thoughtfulness, Chester Nimitz had brought us a Christmas tree decked with ornaments. Everybody enjoyed it. They probably put on the quarterdeck. But even if Santa Claus had come down one of New Jersey's stacks that night, I doubt if we could have summoned the proper holiday spirit. That hurricane, obviously, go back and watch that episode, and you'll see why. As for myself, Halsey writes, 4 consecutive Christmases away from home, 4 Christmases of sea and sand instead of snow and holly, had so saturated me with war on the ocean that I couldn't get into the mood of peace on earth. Unquote. Admiral Halsey's words, as usual, echoed what the vast majority of the men under his command were thinking at that time, too. On the home front, life continued as before. We're going to stomp our foot on this point, Seth. I have this book downstairs called Mythology and the Greatest Generation.
Yep.
And it belies this whole notion that the Americans back home were struggling while the war was going on, and that it was tough in the European theater, in the Pacific theater, and just as tough at home. But that wasn't true, was it, Seth?
Not even close, man. Not even close. And sure, there were some certain situations that were more difficult than they had been in 1940. There is no question. But when you compare it with what's going on in the Philippines or, Bastogne,
The Bulge.
there's please. And this is a Pacific War show, obviously. And no, we're not going to do the European theater for the 115,000th time. But what we are going to do is the home front, because not doing a series on that. We're going to do an episode or 2 on the home front, because I think it's very important that people understand the reality of the situation. And I hate to say this, and it may sound pig-headed, but it's the truth. I don't think anybody could tell it or would tell it like we will tell it, Bill. But that's just my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, so the book that I just spoke about, the mythology and the greatest generation, talks about the heroism, but there's a lot of buffoonery and fraud and thievery and every every kind of negative, sinful tendency
Strikes,
back home.
labor strikes.
Labor strikes that were really withdrawing away from the war effort as guys were fighting and dying.
Yep.
And we'll close this out at the end of the episode and talk a little bit about the poignancy and the contrast. But go ahead, Seth. You were going to say something about the economics situation.
You were on a roll. I wasn't going to stop you. So while rationing was obviously still in place, the black market, which was rampant, became even more so as people grew weary of the war. With no social or economic boundaries, the black market absolutely flourished throughout this country. Contrary to popular belief, it was not difficult to get steaks, hams, sugar, or butter in 1943 and 44. It was not. An undercover federal agent, recorded the sale of over 90 pounds of beef meat to one family in 2 days. Obviously, they were stockpiling, but it was illicit all the same. The myth of the people back home struggling through the war incensed returning veterans on leave or those back home from their tours overseas. Going without was very real on the battlefront, not so much in the good old USA. Families
or any of our allied countries, for that matter, right? Our allies were indeed, struggling.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say exactly. It was certainly more difficult in the UK than it was here in the or Australia than it was here in the United States. That's for sure. This has been the land of plenty for a long, long damn time. Families who had loved ones in service needed to begin holiday preparations as early as cards and packages had to be mailed between September 15th and October 15th to hopefully be delivered to servicemen and women stationed overseas by Christmas. Families sent candy and cookies made more precious due to the rationing of sugar and other ingredients, as well as warm socks, which were always a highly prized possession, often knitted by
Hmm.
hand after a long day of work. Um, you know, that's one thing I remember, after interviewing literally thousands of American servicemen, be they European theater or Pacific theater, almost all of them said that their most prized possession was mail, but anything that they got was socks.
Yeah. Remember Forrest Gump? It is still true in Vietnam, right? Keep your feet dry.
Yeah.
Lieutenant Dan is telling Forrest Gump, change your socks and keep your feet dry. You used to swap your socks, take the wet ones, throw them over your pack, and then put dry ones on and let the wet ones dry over your pack. But yeah, this is going on. And my goodness, Korea, my uncle in the winter in Korea, the only thing he wanted was warm socks. So I hear you, Seth.
So Hallmark, the traditional card company, they had a slogan during the war, which was, and I quote, "Keep them happy with mail," unquote. Hallmark offered cards specially for servicemen and women in each branch of the military, or featured Santa dressed as a soldier. For loved ones serving overseas, the importance of mail and holiday packages from home was second only to food, and sometimes even more so. These reminders of home were important for American servicemen and women's morale, and many a treasured card or gift item was carried throughout the war. On the home front, in
Mhm.
order to help inexperienced postal clerks sort mail, postal zones were established in 1943, your zip codes. Families prayed that a precious letter would arrive, especially this time of year, delivering holiday cheer with word that their loved ones were well and hoping to be home for Christmas next year. Bill.
Yeah. So once again, FDR had his Christmas message broadcast to the country in 1943. It read in part, quote, on this Christmas Eve, there are over 10 million men in the armed forces of the United States alone. 1 year ago, 1.7 million were serving overseas. Today, this figure has been more than doubled to 3,800,000 on duty overseas. By next July 1st, that number overseas will rise to over 5 million men and women. In the Southwest Pacific, in Australia, in China and Burma and India, it is already Christmas Day, so we can correctly say that at this moment, in those far eastern parts where Americans are fighting, today is tomorrow. But everywhere throughout the world, throughout this war that covers the world, there is a special spirit that has warmed our hearts since our earliest childhood, a spirit that brings us closer to our homes, our families, our friends, and neighbors. The Christmas spirit of peace on earth, goodwill towards men. It is an unquenchable spirit. During the past years of international gangsterism and brutal aggression in Europe and Asia, our Christmas celebrations have been darkened with apprehension for the future. We have said, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, but we have known in our hearts that the clouds which have hung over our world have prevented us from saying it with full sincerity and conviction. And even this year, we still have much to face in the way of further suffering and sacrifice and personal tragedy. Our men who have been through the fierce battles of the Solomons, the Gilberts, Tunisia, and Italy know from their own experience and knowledge of modern war that many bigger and costlier battles are still to be fought. But on Christmas Eve this year, I can say to you that at last we may look forward into the future with real, substantial confidence that, however great the cost, peace on earth, goodwill towards men can be and will be realized and ensured. Seth, that's my best fireside chat voice. How did I do?
You did great. You did great.
But I can't keep going. Why don't you close it out?
I will. I will. So FDR continued and he says, and I quote, on behalf of the American people, your own people, I send this Christmas message to you who are in our armed forces. In our hearts are prayers for you and for all your comrades in arms who fight to rid the world of evil. We ask God's blessing upon you, upon your fathers, mothers, wives, and children, all your loved ones at home. We ask that the comfort of God's grace shall be granted to those who are sick and wounded, and to those who are prisoners of war in the hands of the enemy, waiting for the day when they will again be free. And we ask that God receive and cherish those who have given their lives, and that he keep them in honor and in grateful memory of their countrymen forever. God bless all of you God bless all of you who fight our battles on this Christmas Eve. God bless us all. Keep us strong in our faith that we fight for a better day for humankind here and everywhere. Unquote. Again, Bill, I'm sorry, they don't make presidents like that anymore. Someone
They
who's
don't.
that
They don't.
eloquent, someone who's that
Yeah.
eloquent and thoughtful. God, I wish this
Yeah.
country had somebody like that.
We deserve better, don't we?
Yes,
All
we
right.
do.
So, you can't talk about Christmas in World War II without mentioning it at some point. It was, and still is, in both of our opinion, the greatest Christmas song ever written. Written by a Russian Jewish immigrant. You know, what's a Jewish immigrant doing writing a Christmas song? But it's wonderful that he did. We're all blessed by the fact that he did. And his name was Irving Berlin. And in 1941, before the attack on Pearl Harbor, White Christmas soon became the holiday anthem that every deployed American and those waiting for them back home came to adore. Crooned by, yet again, I spoke about him earlier, the incomparable Bing Crosby, who also sang that I'll Be Home for Christmas that we spoke about at the beginning of the episode. White Christmas was first heard on his weekly radio show, The Kraft Music Hall, on Christmas Day 1941. Bing's first rendition of the classic went unnoticed amidst the chaos of the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor. Bing and Irving Berlin, because nobody noticed the song, assumed that it was a flop. They were soon proven wrong. The following year, Bing accepted a role in the movie, one of your favorite movies, Seth, and I love it too, Holiday Inn. In it, Bing plays a nightclub owner whose club is open on holidays only. Seth, why don't you pick it up here?
So, yes, to answer to respond to your statement, Holiday Inn is one of my very favorite movies. Our family watches it every year on Thanksgiving night. It's the first night of the holiday season, if you will, and every year we watch this movie. So the first throughout the film, if you haven't seen it, Bing sings songs dedicated to each federal holiday and popular holidays as well, like, you know, Valentine's Day and all that jazz. The first holiday song he sings, we don't celebrate Valentine's Day in my family. So
it's a commercial invention by Hallmark Cards, but go ahead.
And the candy companies. But the first holiday song that Bing sings is White Christmas at the very beginning of the film. Bing's version of the song is set in his inn in the movie. The lights are off, the Christmas trees lit by candles and colorful lights, with a fire blazing in the hearth and snow falling behind him outside. The visuals in the movie set the mood for what you said, Bill, is the all-time Christmas song, with its wistful, misty-eyed lyrics set to Bing's unforgettable voice. White Christmas quickly came to symbolize deployed Americans' visions of their familial past and hopeful future, as copies of the film and the song were sent overseas to deployed Americans all across the globe. Beginning in November 1942, White Christmas lived at #1 on the hit parade for 11 weeks. How did a secular Christmas song come to symbolize so much to so many? To answer that, I'm going to draw from my good friend, a historian that I used to work with at the National World War II Museum by the name of Josh Schick, who's now, I believe he's the senior curator at the soon-to-open Medal of Honor Museum. He wrote this article when he and I worked together at World War II several years ago, and I'm going to read it from there. Quote, "It had to do with the timing of its release and the type of emotion that the song evoked. White Christmas does not mention war, does not mention production or contributing to a great effort. It is just a simple personal reflection about a single holiday and one's longing for it. The nostalgic and introspective lyrics struck a chord that exemplified the national mood at the time. The desire to be home for Christmas was a feeling that was amplified by the war. Millions were entering military service and were separated from home for the first time at Christmas. Even if they lived in Texas, where a white Christmas was rare, this song made them homesick. Although the common thread of nostalgia and longing to be home for Christmas was the element that bound the millions who listened to and were affected by White Christmas, each individual's reason for their connection is different. For far too many, their last White Christmas fell between the years of 41 1945. That gets to me. Like we talked about before
Mhm.
we record, Bill, I just said, every year we watch Holiday Inn on Thanksgiving night, and and I've seen that movie 100 times, easy.
Mhm.
That first time Bing sings that song in that movie, every single time I choke up, every time, because
Yeah.
I think of all
Yeah.
my friends that I knew that were in the bulge. That's the one that comes to mind immediately back in
Right.
44, 45.
I'm dreaming of a white Christmas with every Christmas card I write. May your days be merry and bright, and may all your Christmases be white.
And you got Bing Crosby's voice that I call vocal velvet. It's like sonic smoky bourbon in vocal cords. I don't know. Is this he's one of a kind.
Yeah.
True enough, American Armed Forces Radio was flooded with requests to play that song week after week after week, long after the holidays had passed. To millions away from home, it was more than a song. It was a feeling, a longing, a desire, a yearning, agonizing yearning for something gentle and comforting. Quote, I'm dreaming of a white Christmas just like the ones I used to know, where the treetops glisten and children listen to hear sleigh bells in the snow. I'm dreaming of a white Christmas with every Christmas card I write. May your days be merry and bright, and may all your Christmases be white. Seth, I've had vocal cord surgery twice, but I think it's going to take a third vocal cord surgery for me to get to anything close to Bing Crosby's voice. Should I go for it?
Go for it. Do it.
Go for it.
Do it. Reincarnation of Bing Crosby.
Yeah, will I
So-
be able to sing? I don't
Yeah.
think so.
I don't know. I always think I sound like Bing in the shower, but I'm sure my wife would tell you the complete opposite of that. So
Yeah.
Christmas 1945 was the first in 4 years with no war for the United States, the first in 6 for Europe, and even longer in Asia. For many, it was hopeful and joyous. It was a hopeful and joyous Christmas, but for many more, millions more, it was not. We will close this special episode, and I know, Bill, you have some things you want to bring up too, with the
Mhm.
following from I can't even pronounce it.
Skull
County.
Kill.
There you go. Thank you.
Yeah. Mhm.
Schuylkill County newspaper in Pennsylvania, and it goes like this, and I quote, "How much more meaning for most of us is contained in the customary greeting, Merry Christmas, this year than 12 months ago. How fortunate we Americans are this year. It might be well to reflect upon this for a passing moment because we are indeed a lucky nation. Unlike last year, we are not worried about any crucial battles. Our land is at peace, and so is the greater part of the world this year. Yes, this land has been blessed, and we should show our thanks to the All High for making this possible. Peace on earth, goodwill to men, really has a meaning this year for the first time in some years, and we sincerely trust nothing will come up during 1946 to change that picture. There are many families right in our own area, of course, to whom Christmas will not mean much this year. There are empty chairs that will never be filled. The battles of last year took their toll of many a gallant lad from this section. There are families who have lost loved ones within the past several days, and there is sickness in other homes to detract from the usual spirit of the Yuletide. All of these things go with life. To those folks, we hope next Christmas will be better. But on the whole, most of us will greet tomorrow with more happiness and less worry than we have since December 7th, 1941. There will be real joy in the families with veterans back in civilian life once more. There will be children overjoyed with their fathers home again. Thoughts of this make us feel good, although our hearts go out to the veterans still in lands of occupation, particularly to those stranded due to transportation difficulties, only a few hundred miles from home. So to all concerned, we extend the annual greeting, Merry Christmas to all, and offer the timely reminder that we should remember the full significance of tomorrow, the birthday of our Savior, and what it stands for, Bill.
Indeed, and as this Advent season comes to a close, Seth, in 2024, we should remember that indeed, the birth of our Savior. Now, I do want to go back to Christmas of 1945, because people during the war believed that once the war was over, it would be all happiness and light. People would be able to settle back into their pre-war routine, and their families would come together, and those that survived could get into, it would be like, old times. That is absolutely not what happened. In fact, old times would never happen. Nothing would ever be the same after the war was over. In December, Christmas 1945, they would need to wade through all kinds of new challenges, not just the veterans, but the families at home, what we now call PTSD, that every combat veteran suffered from in some form or another. And many of them self-medicated with alcohol to deal with the memories that they couldn't release, and the nightmares and the terribles. And another great movie that explores that, Seth, you know what I'm thinking, the night terrors and all of those.
Best years of our lives.
Best years of our lives, right. And all of the strife that goes along with it. The GI Bill was invented. It's supposed to be a great blessing for our returning heroes, but it being run by the government, as it happens today. I just got a denial letter today from our wonderful government for 9/11 because I couldn't prove that I was there, despite all the videotape of me being there. Don't get me started.
Jesus.
Guys like coming back from the war had to deal with those same kinds of issues to gain GI Bill benefits, their VA loans, so they can buy one of these mass-produced cracker box houses, hundreds of thousands of which still exist all around the country.
Mm-hmm.
When you see these, basically what we might call in New Orleans a shotgun house, right? Mm-hmm. Or the 4-room house that were built for all of these returning veterans. Divorces, job struggles, people who can't keep a job because the memories that keep coming back, learning to live with babies they had never met. And many of those babies are listening to this podcast today, I suspect, because they're not babies anymore, but they were born during the war. There was way too many challenges and struggles. So we said earlier, there's a great mythology that's developed about how difficult it was in the United States during the war, struggles and things, shortages, that we said that's a myth. It wasn't so bad. You can't exaggerate the struggles that occurred after the guys came home. The lucky ones that came home ended up having so many problems that went on throughout their lives. And many of them died from those problems. Heroes like Ira Hayes, finding himself in the drunk tank. Heroes like Captain Charles McVeigh going through a court-martial, and on that Christmas 1945, finding himself under house arrest for having his ship sunk out from under him. There are hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of those horrible stories of what the guys came through when they came back, just as there are today from the veterans of our 20-year war. So, Seth, it was not all happiness and light. It's right that we remember the Christmases during the war, but we're nowhere near ending this podcast. We have plenty of episodes to do, folks, and we'll talk about the post-war period, at least some, before we finish this podcast. But I just want to make sure we put the right focus on the ending of this episode, Seth.
You know, and to pile on to something that you mentioned, I don't know how many minutes ago, and you just said it in passing, but the light bulb went off in my head when you said it, and I guess now's as good a time as any. You mentioned Jimmy Stewart, and It's a Wonderful Life, and I'm probably saying just like you, every Christmas Eve, the family sits there and we watch Jimmy Stewart and It's a Wonderful Life. If you know anything about the history of that movie, and I'm not going to get into all the ins and outs, but Jimmy Stewart was a bona fide, honest to God combat veteran. Like, he was not like a lot of other Hollywood stars that just went over there, had his picture taken, and then came back home. No, he flew many, well over a dozen combat missions in B-24s, flying with the 8th Air Force out of England. And he saw the elephant many times. And he was seriously affected by what he went through, by what he did, but what he had to do in the war. And it's no secret. I mean, Jimmy Stewart had PTSD bad when he came home from the United States, like really bad. And that movie was one of the first he made after he got out of the service. And then, yes, he retired as a brigadier general. And I mean, he was the real deal. Jimmy Stewart was the real deal. But It's a Wonderful Life was one of the very first movies that he made once he got back. And it may have been the first, but I could be wrong there. Regardless of this, there are several scenes in there when George Bailey loses it.
Struggling when he's losing it because the money is gone.
Yes.
His uncle lost the money. And you see that agony in his eyes. I
That's
talked
real.
about Peter O'Toole earlier. You see it here too with Jimmy Stewart, don't you, Seth?
Yes, you do. And the scene in particular that tears me apart every time is when he loses it in front of his wife and children. And that's not acting. He's not acting.
Stop it.
Yeah.
No.
That is not acting. That
when
was
he's
him.
on the bridge too, and he says, God,
Dear
show
Lord,
me a
help
way.
me. Show me a way. Exactly. That's
I'm not a praying man.
if you know Jimmy Stewart's war experience and you know what happened to him, you know that that's not acting. That is real. That was his way of expressing his emotions, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. And we didn't do this episode to put a damper on the holidays. Like we do everything, we wanted to get your focus right. If you're watching this show, if you're listening to this show, then you obviously are already fans of the show, and for that we thank you. We're very grateful to you, but we want to make sure that everybody understands that it was not peachy keen. It wasn't all rainbows and unicorns. It wasn't candy canes and filled stockings every single year. And exactly to your point, Bill, the war affected people long after, and for many, a lot, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions. Christmas was some of the worst times of their lives. And I'm talking after the war, because, with Christmas comes alcohol. It just does, whether you drink or not, certainly family members do at Christmas. And that brings about the demons. And it's just,
I said McVeigh earlier, every Christmas he would get those letters from the families, right? Hope you're having a Merry Christmas. We'd be having a Merry Christmas too if you hadn't killed our son. So it brought back memories of the people who were no longer alive, of the Christmases that they, experienced in war zones. It was many of them really didn't want the holidays to come. They wanted to kind of just rush through the holidays because there were so many bad memories associated with it. They would just get depressed. It wouldn't be a celebration for them. And it's so good that today, so many of us are able to, celebrate Christmas for what it is. But for many of these guys, they couldn't.
Exactly. Bill, I think that's a very, very good way to wrap this one up. Is there anything else you want to add before we close it up?
No, thanks, Seth.
Well, with this one airing on Christmas Eve, I'm going to speak for Bill as I spoke for him earlier today in an email and wish all of you who are watching and or listening a very, very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. May, the good Lord bring his blessings upon you and your family throughout the rest of your lives, but certainly this upcoming year. And hopefully you're able to enjoy Christmas and the holidays this year with your families and friends. So, and we want to thank you always for listening and or watching and being with us. And we want to thank you for sticking with us through all these episodes and for all the ones to come. So we do hope that you do enjoy what we put out and hope you do have a good holiday season. And God bless you all. So with that, I want to say thank you very much for listening and or watching. Once again, my name is Seth Perrodin. Thank you as always. Bill, my brother, bring us home.
And I'm Bill Tody. God bless each of you, everyone. See you again next week.